Hello everybody and welcome once again to the NSUN AGM 2021. So yeah, it feels very strange. It's been like kind of a year. I can't quite believe it. And this is now the second iteration of the LGBTQ+ panel, which we had loads of fun recording last year, and we had so much lovely feedback from people that the NSUN team asked if we could run a similar session again. So we have done, and it's kind of a follow-on, as I'll explain. So for those of you who don't know, so I'm Amy Rushton. I also go by Ames, and my preferred pronouns are they, them. I'm a member, but also a trustee of NSUN. And outside of NSUN, I'm a researcher and teacher, drawing on my lived and family experience of mental health injustice. So this year, we are focusing on care as a form of resistance for our communities, inspired by an observation by Soraya Aisha from last year's panel. Unfortunately, Soraya couldn't join us this year, but we wholeheartedly thank her for being the inspiration for continuing this discussion. So we're so delighted to be joined by three amazing panelists, including a returnee. And in a moment, they'll introduce themselves and kick off with their initial reflections on the notion of care as a form of resistance. So I thought I would begin with kind of my own kind of, I guess, response to the prompt. So I'm currently in recovery from burnout. So unsurprisingly, a lot of this burnout was COVID related. So I think like a lot of people, I was cut off from my friends, family, and also my wider kind of LGBTQ+ community. The boundaries between workspace and home space were shattered, and I was working really, really long hours. And due to family care circumstances, I could only virtually participate in protests for Black Lives Matter and trans rights, which is really hard. The disruption and uncertainty meant I basically abandoned the self-care practices and rituals that I'd so carefully put in place prior to the first lockdown. I think like a lot of people, I kind of had, you know, you kind of thought you'd be stuck at home, that you'd be able to do more of these, you know, self-care practices and rituals, but no, I completely abandoned them. And it's only recently that I've had the time to bring back those practices, and it's made me realise how necessary self-care is, not just for myself, but for those I love, who I work with and encounter through life generally. In short, it's made me realise how important care is on a relational level. Looking after myself makes me able to look after others. That said, I have the privilege of having that time, and this is what also fires me up. So in the epilogue to A Burst of Light, Audre Lorde asserts that caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. As I think a lot of us will know, Lorde self-identified as, you know, a Black lesbian poet, warrior, mother, and this kind of gives you a sense of why it's sort of an act of political warfare. All those kind of intersecting identities kind of put added pressure on why she kind of needed to kind of use self-care as a form of resistance against all these different oppressions. And I think it's very interesting that we see this quote a lot, often on Instagram, kind of hanging around in the, you know, kind of inspirational quotations, but it is such an important and such a deep sentiment and kind of an intellectual reflection. And for me, thinking about kind of the last year and thinking about kind of Lorde's work, in reflecting on how I care for myself and others, it actually kind of emphasised the deep entrenchment of lack of care in our current moment. So when we think about, particularly in England, the kind of the rolling back of restrictions around COVID, preventative measures, and how that affects people who are with autoimmune issues and also like with disabilities, and also elderly people and people who are just vulnerable, you know, particularly to infection, and how there's kind of a lack of care and sort of understanding around that. Of course, around ideas for trans people and non-binary people, particularly children and teenagers, people who experience racism, as we talked about in the last panel. We kind of knew that, you know, 2020 wasn't going to be the year that solved racism by any means. And in fact, you know, I think it's kind of brought up, you know, more issues, particularly in and across Britain. And also, I think something that will be of interest to everybody, regardless of how you identify listening to this panel, is also the uneven access to mental health services, and kind of the amount of kind of almost self-preservation that is needed in order to kind of assert ourselves and our rights, and who has those rights and who has kind of autonomy over the way they manage their illness, how they think or talk about their mental health issues as well. So it's very kind of a very personal and also very broad introduction, but for good reason. And I will now turn to our panelists, and we're going to start with the lovely Sabah. Thank you, Sabah.
Thank you, Ames, and thanks for starting off in such a personal way. It's actually made it feel a lot easier for me to share as well. So my name is Sabah. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs. I'm one of the joint heads of the youth service at Gender Intelligence, a national trans youth charity. Also one of the co-founders of Colours Youth Network. I am a psychotherapist in training, a public speaker and writer, and I will just say I've got a book coming out in January, supporting trans people of color, how to make your practice inclusive. And I foster cats, so there might be a cat running around somewhere, so I do apologize for any background noise. I will not apologize if she comes on screen though, because we've all agreed over the last couple of years, it's so cute when that happens. So yeah, the panel last year, when we started talking about care as resistance, I thought, well, actually, I had to say it to myself a few times, like care is resistance, because I feel like, I don't know, I think care can sound quite passive, and like it's just, or self-care is just something that you do on the weekend, or it's not really taken seriously. I'm talking to myself, but care is survival, and it is making sure that we survive, and it's love, and it's healing, and those are all things that we need to make sure that we as individuals last, and as communities that we grow as well. I'm saying that especially thinking about how much systemic and institutional oppression tells us to shrink and erases us, our identities and our histories as well. It was really relevant last year when we were going through a pandemic and the various lockdowns, and we were like, well, I was forced to care about myself and think about what care is on such a basic level, because most things in my life were stripped back. And so I was listening to the panel last year as well, ahead of this one, and I was thinking about, okay, so what's different now, Sabah? My hair is much longer, definitely, but I am afraid to say I don't know if I've put into practice as much as I wanted to, care as a form of resistance. I feel like, because I've been caring for others for so long, I was caring for my dad, who passed away last year. I'm a youth worker, I'm a therapist, but this year has really forced me to care for myself, especially as I'm not a caregiver anymore. And I also had COVID as well, and those moments of like having space and being physically forced to stop and slow down have forced me to ask for care. But before that, I have to know that I need care and that I'm lacking in something, which has been a bit of an eye-opener recently. Ames, you saying you're in recovery from burnout is, I don't know why, that's just made me really kind of deep, like the seriousness of like burnout and what that does to us. And it is a process of experiencing it, but also recovering from it. And I think I've been operating on burnout for such a long time, and like so long, I think, like can't even comprehend how long, because I've just realized that my body has just been a state of like, oh, I just got to push past this. I just got to get through this bit. I'll be okay. I just need to sleep it off. But actually, it's big. I've just not realized how serious what I'm feeling is, or not wanted to call it burnout because I don't think it is serious, or maybe I'll know it when I see it, or I'll know burnout when I feel it, right? But I started having some physical weird things happening. Last summer, I started experiencing like dizziness, and I was like it was like all the worst bits about being very, very drunk. If you drink, then it's just like, just the room is spinning, and it's just this nauseating feeling. And I just thought, oh, I've got low blood pressure and my head is spinning. Sometimes you stand up too quickly and your head goes a bit dizzy, but it was like times 100. And then I just kind of ignored it. Had some sweets or some sugary stuff, and I was like, that's good. It wasn't good. It kept happening at these random times, and it really just stopped me from doing what I was doing, which was infuriating because very much a dealer. I'm a very active person, and then I realized I spoke to my GP, and I realized, and they suggested it might be vertigo, which I was not happy about. Again, I was like, how is this happening? Like, where is this coming from? I couldn't make sense of like a cause as to why my body is failing me essentially. And then I recently got diagnosed with migraines, and the doctor was like, okay, so you don't really need any medication for this, but what you need to do is get a good night's sleep, keep hydrated, rest and relaxation, do a bit of exercise, and try these supplements. And I was like, okay, so I just need to look after myself. Are you kidding me? Like, that's it. And that was when I really realized, like, oh my God, okay, an evening off is not enough time to rest. A long weekend is not actually a break. And a week holiday whilst picking up other emails is not actually a holiday. So I've realized I need so much care if I'm going to be able to even think about resisting any kinds of pressures or oppressions. So I mean, luckily I've got a really supportive workplaces plural, and I'm going to be taking a period of 6 months off next year to rest and finish off my masters. But I will mostly be resting. But I can talk a bit more about kind of professional spheres and workplaces later. But I just wanted to also share kind of personal things going on as well. That's me.
Okay,
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Sabah, and thank you for that, sharing so really on personal reflections as well. And I think something that I'd be interested in picking up as we go through is like two things in particular. I think the idea of kind of burnout and recovery and the idea of resilience, I think becomes very knotty, particularly when we start to think about kind of how other issues, or not other issues, but other kind of oppressions like around disability and race, and also a gender identity, and particularly and that how that also links to kind of like sort of medical and health services as well, and the fact that even individual GP practices can be so different. Even something around, you're talking about migraines, then it was quite different to an experience I had. And we start to kind of add in all these kind of other additional kind of factors that affect the four of us in various ways here. It just kind of gets really knotty and very sort of even more kind of complicated as well. So thank you so much for sharing that. And but before we sort of open it up as well, we still have our two new panelists to introduce. So I will turn to Josie, if you would like to introduce yourself properly and also give your initial response as well.
Hi, thanks for having me, and thanks both for those introductions, which frame the conversation powerfully and importantly. So my name's Harry Josephine Giles, or Josie for short. I'm a writer and performer by trade, that's my work. But I'm also someone that's been involved in various direct action and protest political movements for the last 20 years. This is a frightening thing to think about when I think about it. And at the moment, I suppose the political area that I'm most involved with is around trans healthcare, and both creating community resources for trans healthcare and lobbying and pushing for reforms to the state trans healthcare system. And that's what I'm going to talk about now. I think a sort of a kind of broader political picture of care between trans people as a form of resistance to that system. And the self that I'm bringing to that is I'm both transgender and autistic, and through those identities and diagnoses, I'm someone that has been psychiatrized since childhood, someone that has been variously neglected, supported, coerced, and involved with psychiatric processes for a very, very long time. those kind of complicated networks of relationships to psychiatric processes, and being trans is very much one of those. So the situation for trans people in the UK at the moment, and for trans people in many other parts of the world as well, is, I would say, one of medical abandonment. I think the thing that a wider public is just starting to get a grip on is the scale of the waiting list problem and the number of trans people that have never seen professional trans healthcare. The waiting lists from referral to first appointment are usually around 3 to 6 years, depending on where you are in the country right now. So that's the really famous one, but the abandonment doesn't stop once you actually have an appointment at a gender identity clinic, which is the clinic that NHS trans healthcare is administered through. The care within the gender identity clinic is itself generally a form of abandonment. And just to give a really basic example of that, I have been in both private and public trans healthcare for the last 3 years. And I've never had an appointment with an endocrinologist, despite being on hormones, right? Despite being on hormones before I was in the health system, I have never had an appointment with an endocrinologist, which is a medical practitioner on the hormonal system, right? So there's just a really basic form, like the care is insufficient within the system. And the reason for that, I would say, is actually rooted in what the gender clinic is. The gender clinics in the UK, and it's a model that was imported from the US and has been exported elsewhere in the world, come from a psychiatric system, and come from a system that was actually built on policing, creating and enforcing gender norms that took gender variant people and in some cases coerced people into forms of treatment that they didn't want, and in other cases gate-kept people from forms of treatment that they did want in order to maintain, as cisgender and as heterosexual looking, a system of gender as we could have. That is where I would say the gender identity clinic comes from. And those ideals of gender, those sexist ideals of gender, which are also ways of policing and enforcing racism, classism, ableism, they're all an entangled system within this process, and means that the contemporary gender identity clinic is unable to respond in a patient-centered way to the complexity of trans life. It's still built on a model of diagnosis that expects trans people to follow a particular pathway, to move through that pathway in a particular way. And when trans people vary from that, as all of us do in one way or another, it's not able to do anything other than abandon our healthcare needs. So the reason I'm saying all of that, what I'm trying to set up there, is that abandonment means that trans people have to care for each other, that trans people seeking transition-related healthcare or just transitions are always looking after each other's medical care, teaching each other about medical care, teaching each other how to transition, teaching each other how to cope with the violence of a transphobic world. And I do really I can't emphasize enough how ordinary it is for trans people to do things like share hormones, teach you how to interpret blood tests, respond to each other's side effects and surprise healthcare needs. I have brought a healthcare complication from my transition to the gender identity clinic and had a doctor say, "We've never heard of this before. I don't know what to do," literally. And then I have gone to trans forums and everyone has said, "Oh, this is really common. Here's what you do about it." That's the kind of trans care that I'm talking about in a really, really basic way. So the proposition I want to make then to round this off, and this is kind of providing another political frame of analysis to the same stuff about self-care and looking after each other that have been in the previous two introductions, is that the way that trans people are looking after each other is an act of resistance to that structure of gender that is created through the gender identity clinic. It's an act of resistance to patriarchal gender norms as they are enforced by psychiatry. We are teaching each other to get what we want from psychiatrists. We're teaching each other the lines to give to psychiatrists to get what we want, or despite psychiatrists when they're abandoning us, or despite the medical professionals that are working within the medical model that has been provided to them by a psychiatric system of trans healthcare. So we're creating these trans lives beyond what the clinics can offer us, both out of necessity because we've been abandoned, and also out of resistance to the frameworks that have offered us. We're far from the only group that is doing this. This is common for all sorts of groups that are working within medical systems, psychiatric systems, political systems, and structures of oppression. I just think that trans people offer one model for thinking through how care has been not only not provided, but prevented by a particular healthcare system, and then how caring for each other has resisted that system. So there's my introduction.
Oh, thank you. And it's just so rich as well, Josie. And I think you kind of provided a very eloquent kind of connection as well between, if anybody ever kind of wonders about the connections between kind of grassroots like mental health injustice advocacy and kind of like and kind of mad activism and sort of trans rights and trans issues, you just kind of like really just neatly summarized it and sort of got that connection there, because I think there'll be many members of NSUN watching this, you know, who do not identify as trans or non-binary, being, oh yeah, kind of that, yeah, I see. And really interesting as well, because I think the way you sort of set that up is the idea about it was almost like the care system as being resistant as well. Like, obviously it works in two ways, doesn't it? Care is resistance, but also resistant care. And so thank you so much, and so much to grab from that as well. And last but very much not least is Shon. And Shon, would you care to introduce yourself and also provide your response as well?
Yeah, I'm Shon, pronouns she, her, hers. And yeah, I am a writer by profession. I'm a freelance writer and author. And then previously, before, I'm fully freelance as a writer now, but previously I've worked within the kind of LGBTQ charity and NGO complex system. I worked for Stonewall for 4 years as an engagement officer with trans communities in Wales, in order to kind of build bridges with the trans communities that are in Wales, between that and an organisation that had only, when I started, recently become trans inclusive. And I've also worked with, like, for example, Amnesty International on kind of more informal campaigning. And my writing tends to focus on trans lives in the UK. My book, The Transgender Issue, is a kind of political survey and polemic about the conditions, the material conditions in which trans people lead their lives, including in relation to some of the stuff that Josie spoke about with healthcare and some of these ideas as well that we're discussing today. I feel in the spirit of kind of, yeah, I've really appreciated the other panelists sort of talking openly about their own kind of context and response to this on a personal level. And when I think about the Audre Lorde and the idea of self-care, and I think it's a term that obviously now is very much doing the rounds, and it's something, and of course there is this kind of potential consumerist idea of it that's all about like bubble baths and stuff like that. I'm an addict in recovery. It's not something I really necessarily talk about all the time, but given, you know, the nature of this panel. So for me, that kind of what Lorde says about the difference between self-care and self-indulgence has a specific way of that I interpret it. Like, if I do not care for myself, I could potentially endanger my own life. I have to kind of maintain that regardless of what goes on. But self-care isn't self-indulgence, because some of the impulses that I've had to work on in my life mean that, like, if I wanted to indulge myself, I'd actually harm myself. So self-care is sometimes doing the things I don't want to do. And connected to that, self-care is connected to care for others too, because caring about and for others, when you struggle, you know, particularly with addiction issues, or when you struggle with some types of mental health issues, is that they're a form of your recovery too, because they take you out of yourself and perhaps your negative thought patterns, etc. However, there is a difficult balance to strike there between what you're capable of giving, and then slipping into kind of slightly obsessive patterns with, like, you know, workaholism, burnout. And I think in activist circles, I think we all have to be careful about where it crosses a line from self-care into, workaholism, and sometimes ego as well. I think we all have to keep that in check. Is that, you know, movement's supposed to be like, you know, non-vertical, kind of horizontal, that we work as a collective. But of course, like we're all human beings. We're all kind of drawn to particularly activist work because it's touched our own lives. but there can, we all have to kind of resist the impulses to savior complexes, the fact that we might be trying to resolve things, our own personal issues in the work we do, but not in the healthiest way for ourselves or others. And that's something I'm thinking about a lot at the moment, because a lot of my work takes me into kind of quite mainstream media spaces at the moment, because I'm doing a book tour. And I have the odd personal dynamic in the kind of cis-dominated media, where people, for example, will want a token and will want like a mascot or an emblem, and can be very flattering about that too. And I have to be careful to judge both that I don't want to become that for my own self-care, because it's a burden I cannot carry, and also because it would ultimately not help a kind of wider movement, but also to also be conscious that is, if you do media work, particularly as a trans person in the UK at the moment, you are constantly working in a hostile environment. And with that requires a level of hypervigilance, a kind of like seeing things before they come. What's going to be asked of me? What's this person's agenda? And that, of course, is exhausting, and it's unsustainable. And it will ultimately render anyone useless, and the burnout rate of that is quite high. And in a lot of cases, it's not actually useful for the work of, advancing like the liberation of trans people, or indeed anyone else. So those are like some things that really am like very live, particularly the latter part about burnout in the media is obviously something that's directly affecting me right now. And I think, for me, I think it's always important to bring in the point of self-care, is that sometimes self-care is about it's not pure self-indulgence. It's about actually challenging what your own instincts sometimes are leading you to do, because your own instincts often don't, maybe not be the healthiest thing for you. And certainly that's something I can speak to. And then, I think in terms of the pandemic, I think we're all readjusting. I'm certainly readjusting to that. I hadn't realized quite how much the pandemic was affecting me psychologically until actually the lockdowns eased. And then it's suddenly, I think, the readjustment to capitalist work systems, a kind of culture of kind of like particularly hustle culture. I think one thing that I think marginalized people or minority groups often have too, and it really links in with what Josie was talking about, is what I've been reviewing recently, is this odd loop that a lot of us in the trans community have, where maybe if we're trying to do paid work, whether that's advocacy work or media work or doing panels or whatever, because of the terrible healthcare system, often that comes from desperation to fund our own healthcare. So I've realized that for the last 5 years, I have been advocating for trans lives, but partly to fund my own healthcare. And so there is this odd loop of dependence where I am essentially sort of having to sell parts of my own marginalization to people, often in spaces that is this actually doing the work? Probably not, but really what it's doing the work for is allowing me to access that. And I think in terms of what Josie said as well about healthcare, I think that's a big one. And I think I've been lucky to benefit from mutual aid and care within trans communities too, but also, I've reflected, I think there were large parts of my medical transition, especially when I, chose to, there were some things I went abroad for, etc., where I went alone. I've had surgery alone. I've woken up and recovered alone. I've gone under general anesthetic alone. And that's a lot of people's experience. And I think at the time you just harden to it. But unfortunately that does have repercussions. And I think without community care, without those networks, you can't necessarily rely on the kind of cisgender heterosexual structures around you. People, friends, family, colleagues, often if you're part of a minority group in an environment where people don't even really realize the kind of psychic burden of something like accessing healthcare, they're not able to help you. And so while, I think a lot of it happens in informal, ephemeral spaces, again, like Josie mentioned about online forums, Twitter, Facebook, closed Facebook groups, it's certainly that sort of stuff is only trying to compensate for an infrastructure that isn't there, and the one that could be much more robust. And it was pleasing to see, I think, Queer Care and other groups in the pandemic, the Outside Project in London, that really kind of were able to do that practical work. But it has a huge burnout on the activists involved with those groups too. So it's a bit cyclical. And I think, yeah, that's just my response. I'll leave it there. And yeah, I hope that was useful. Going last is always a bit difficult because everyone else has said quite useful things.
No, so yeah, I apologise for that, Shon, but that was very, very useful, and thank you for being honest as well. And I'll admit, actually, because I was aware about obviously the book is excellent, and I was aware that you're on book tour, which is why, like, when we were talking about, like, to invite to the panel, and one of the things I was thinking that was on the forefront of my mind was thinking about, how, kind of, are you caring for yourself when you're kind of in such an intense spotlight, and so that's why I was delighted that, you agreed, you made time to come, but also the fact that you just reflected on that as well. And actually it kind of leads on to kind of, I think, the thing that I want to kind of investigate more with the three of you in particular, and I can relate to this in a certain way, but I think for each of you as panelists, this is, for me, really key, which is the fact that this sense of having to kind of step into spaces where often you're not just in terms of being, I don't mean like as a marginalized community and minority, I don't mean in that sense, but in terms of often being either one of the few or the first. So for example, like Sabah, I was thinking about you saying about the book that you're writing, that that will be published next year, everything goes all right, and the fact that that it's fantastic to to be able to produce that resource, but there's also a level of kind of the fact that you're sort of being there, like in your role as a youth worker and in your training at the moment, but it's like it's often because it's a gap that's like that everyone's identified that they need to fill. And I think something that that I think all three of you kind of alluded to is that often that kind of vacuum of care is something that I think we're all probably quite happy to kind of step into, but it's also trying to negotiate how to be there for others, and also to kind of be there for yourself, and particularly when there might not be anybody else or very few people ahead of you who can kind of offer that support. So I guess, like, to a bit rambly, but I think in summary, just kind of thinking about what have your kind of past, present, and what would you kind of like in the future kind of support systems for you to kind of be there for other people, but at the same time also kind of have that support for yourself as well. That care.
I mean, I can just jump in and say that I definitely think there needs to be better access, for example, to therapy, not just tied, to, because I think the best hope people have is if they're tied to like a certain kind of job where the employer will fund that. But we need to be looking at kind of access to therapy as a kind of right, I think, in generally, because obviously a lot of people are not within the workplace, particularly, in trans communities, in communities, people living with disabilities, and working class communities generally. I think there is this, it's just getting worse and worse and worse. And while there can be these very pathologizing models of like psychiatry in the trans community, when you want like elective therapy, there's nothing. So there's this odd kind of, like, we could be completely diverting resources from one to the other, and that would be my suggestion. I'm interested in what Sabah has to say, because I think working with young people, I think that's a particular one, because if you're the adult and you're working with youth, I imagine that there's a particular sense of burden, because you feel like, we know that for trans youth, there's been this year with the Bell case and things like that, a huge amount of anxiety amongst trans youth. And I think as a trans adult, I don't know whether or not you feel there's specific dynamics there where you feel you have to kind of be strong because you're the adults.
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, God, what an exceptionally terrible year for trans healthcare. It is hard as trans adults, because all of the things that are happening are deeply affecting us too, that's affecting our young people. And I think it's just really given us more of incentive to just be really transparent with our young people and be open where it is appropriate. Like, you know, just outside of the healthcare, you know, our capacity all kind of shifted as youth workers because of responding to a pandemic, and then all our individual and personal experiences within that. We had to kind of scale back on some of the things we wanted to do, which is difficult because essentially we're saying to young people, we can't give you as much as we want. But we had, you know, having explaining why and saying that we need to care for ourselves meant that they understood it, I hope, and that it is all building towards a youth work practice and youth work spaces that are actually going to last longer than if we did them all right now, you know, which I think is is one of the pressures that come with working in as you know, as each other in our communities, like as the only trans person, as the only person of color, as the only XYZ. It's like, oh well, I have to do this right now, and especially when you're the only one. I think, Shon, you were talking about the where we might think self-care, we might think workaholism is self-care, you know, where we're like, oh, but you know, doing this work is really great, but it's actually just adding pressure because we're the only one. I feel like it's a burden that we have to do it. But I mean, it's really hard. I mean, I'm saying this and I can hear the hesitancy in my voice when I'm just like, I know I still feel like, oh, I have to do something because who else is going to do it if I don't do it? And that pushes me, you know, pushes our communities into a state of burnout. But we have to have those boundaries for ourselves and think about the bigger picture. I think we were talking at work about how we've been responding to a crisis, like with the pandemic, with healthcare and other changes and injustices. But we need to now build a model where we aren't responding to crisis, but where we are kind of working alongside crisis. Like the crisis, there will always be crisis and you know, sudden changes to our communities, and we'll have to face certain things. So let's keep going, but not in a reactive way. And it's hard because it does look like from the outside that we are slowing down or not doing as much as we want to. But what I have seen is us building self-care into our youth work spaces. So with Colours Youth Network, we have youth worker gatherings where we've been just having like half an hour together online to stretch, someone led like mindfulness practice and a yoga session. We just play games and we just have this like nice chunk of care that comes into so it becomes a part of our youth work practice. And at Gendered Intelligence, it's just built into our conversations. Like when we have meetings, we just acknowledge like, okay, so everyone's feeling really, really tired or really low this morning. All right, let's just slow down a bit. And we say like when we're working or when we aren't going to be working, so that when someone sends a message that's after the time they said they were going to send it, they can be like, you said you were going to finish today. So there's those kind of moments of it becoming a part of our practice, and I think that's something that I think we need more of is people around us to be caring for us, like community care, I guess. We need allies, if you know, if that word means something to you, or people who you know, our friends, our family, to care for us. And I think this goes back to what I was saying about being able to take this 6-month extended, you know, period of leave, and that just be like, you know, it was an offer from my workplace to say, you know, you want to take some time off, how about this? And it just, I think I maybe well, I'll speak for myself, but it's hard for me to visualize what actual care and rest and recovery looks like. So I think it helped me to then my workplace to be like, this is what you're going to do for 6 months. You're going to take January to slow down, and then you're going to do this and that, and then you're going to come back and start winding back up again in June, and you're going to be ready to kind of come back in. And I wouldn't visualize that because I don't feel like I deserve it or I could, or because I'm always thinking, but if I don't do this work, then who's going to do it? So those questions were just taken out of my head because it was like, well, you're not going to be here, so go go and rest. Don't do this, and don't think about this. So yeah, we need people around us to care about us too, I guess, is the bottom line for that.
Yeah, and I really hear that as well. And I think something as well as kind of like around therapy, something you like that Shon brought up, I think something you were saying in Sabah about ideas of like kind of mindfulness and meditation and yoga, and often, so even outside of kind of talking therapies or kind of medical, or like kind of more sort of medicalized or like kind of psychiatric or psychological sort of therapies, also things like alternative in inverted commas therapies as well, about who do we have. And I was thinking about, even for myself, and a lot of it is something I'm interested in doing is I've been practicing yoga for nearly a decade. And even though, and actually I was thinking about all the kind of the sort of queer and trans and sort of and disabled practitioners that I follow, it's all kind of in the US, and I know there's people in the UK which actually not having that kind of accessibility. And of course, and things like even talking therapy in the UK, and even things like kind of yoga, and sort of thinking about kind of more kind of spiritual practices, it's still very much kind of white cis women, often of a certain kind of age or or economic bracket as well. And I think not having that kind of, not to kind of bring it down to just representation, but I think there's also a sense of, well, that kind of form of self-care, which is really important, to be able to talk, having someone who has the professional training and capabilities of being able to have to sit with kind of your problems and your narrative, and to help you heal outside of just your community. It actually, we don't have that kind of diversity there. And I think it was interesting after particularly Black Lives Matter, not after, in terms of last year's kind of like the wave, there was kind of a focus on thinking about kind of Black therapists in particular, but actually it's, I've noticed that sort of, at least in mainstream kind of online presence, it's kind of died away a little bit as well. With Josie, this kind of like, all this kind of speaks to directly to what you were kind of offering in your initial response. So I imagine there's kind of quite a lot of things kind of flying around that you kind of want to respond to.
So to build on everything that's been said, I suppose when I think about like the problem of care, what care I want to be able to give, I think the first thing that my mind goes to is wages, or more broadly like economic resources, because we can plug away forever at like, I never feel like I have enough care to actually like deal with what I'm dealing with in the world. I'm constantly like going through cycles of burnout. I never feel like I'm looking after my friends as much as I want to look after my friends. I never feel like my friends are looking after me as much as I want my friends to look after me. And everyone around me is suffering from a deficit of care. Like, that's the situation that we're in. So no wonder we keep burning out. And we keep burning out not because we're all doing care wrong, and not because we're bad people, and not because we're insufficient, but because it's actually impossible to get enough care in the socioeconomic situation that we're in. And when I think about trans people as a constituency, it's a group of people who are tend to have extraordinary experiences of homelessness, of separation from family, of separation from generational wealth, experiences of poverty, who as a cohort are largely working class. Like, it's trans people as a group tend to not have the economic resources that are necessary for looking after themselves and each other in a world which is relentlessly transphobic and is also denying care at a national level, right? So along with the holistic approaches to care and the need of embedding care within political movements that have been talked about here, I think we have to think about how that is resourced. And when we're thinking about how that's resourced, something that I sometimes bristle a little bit at, the memification of self-care and the memification of self-care as warfare, care as resistance. when I start thinking about who it is that is actually doing care work in the world, right? Which is that care work in our communities, care work as a waged job and as an unwaged job, tends to fall to people who are feminized, tends to fall to people who are racialized, tends to fall to migrant workers, tends to fall to working class workers, right? So when we talk about the need for care in the world, I'm thinking, well, in an unequal economic system, in an oppressive economic system, who is going to actually get that care and who is actually going to be providing that care? And so when we're asking for care within our movements and we're asking for care within ourselves, I think that also always has to be coupled with a demand for economic resources for everyone, because we suffer from a deficit of care, not from our own lack or not only from our own failures, and we're all always failing and learning, but because we literally cannot provide the care on the resources that we're currently given.
I'm so glad you mentioned that about care services. That was something that I was thinking about, and sort of sitting and reflecting with that, is that kind of the way in which even something thinking about kind of care homes and thinking about the recent kind of Channel 4 drama and dramatisation of thinking about, I mean, there's been a crisis in care as an institution. It's not even an institution, it's sort of like a crumbling kind of like, haunted house at this stage. And I'm from Stoke-on-Trent. I'm still living here. I talked about this last time on the panel, and within walking distance, it's there's 4 or 5 care homes, and it's really interesting thinking about kind of the ways in which it's just devalued as a career. And yet I know that a lot of neighbours and people I've grown up with and friends, family who have those roles, it's so important to them, but they often feel like they end up being pushed out because of the economic disadvantage. And then how are those gaps then plugged? And it's and the fact that I think it's not controversial to to suggest that we live in our current moment, and particularly our mainstream political moment and system is kind of built on a kind of a dismissal of care, both as kind of a profession, but also just in terms of it's this sense of kind of individual responsibility. But actually it's just it's just further denigration of care, and also a way of dodging more they're not even complex questions, but more questions that a government like we currently have don't want to talk about, which is economic disparity and kind of in all those. Well, the fact we saw, didn't we, with the race report, it was like apparently there's no racism in Britain. So the idea that we're ever going to have a proper kind of discussion about the value of care, and also about who wage labour and everything, is just kind of not optimistic at the moment. So for this last part of the panel, I would like to kind of offer you to reflect kind of in on kind of what sustains you in the work that you do, because I think in just to different degrees it's all kind of public facing. There's often a lot of support, particularly I think for youth. I mean, whether it's officially kind of through Sabah's role, one of Sabah's roles I should say, and I also have I'm also a multi-role person, multiple jobs, but like, as a teacher I certainly find that, and I'm sure I know Josie and Shon as like artists and writers and kind of public facing, often there's kind of a lot of kind of expectation, particularly from youth as well, trans youth in particular. So what do you individually, kind of find that kind of sustains you in that work, and kind of hopefully prevents or kind of provides resilience against burnout?
So I'm probably going to try and be positive here, but I just might not turn my phone first, which is that like I can talk about all the like little individual things that sustain me. Like I read a lot of books by and about trans people, and those are my those are like my fortress. Literally, like you can't see them right now, but there's like a bookshelf full of books by and about trans people there, and there's a bookshelf full and about trans people there, and they're on either side of my bed, like protective pillars. Like that's my safe place. I do my stretches every day. I try and get outside every day. I do bird watching. Like these are the things that do sustain like the conditions of my life. I need to get up into the hills once a week, and if that's not happening, then I tend to be in trouble. But I think what I wanted to reflect on more is this is something I mentioned earlier, which is kind of the inevitability of failure in all this. That one of the more toxic elements of the memification of self-care is that it gets worked into a sort of quite a bourgeois, a perennial bourgeois practice of like self-perfectibility, and an idea that we can any of us can be these like well-disciplined, self-loving, self-caring, other-caring people, like all the time, and like being that kind of good person becomes another way of like holding social status and not being like messy, messed up, angry, upset. So one thing that sustains me then in the face of that is acceptance, of working towards acceptance and forgiveness of my failures, my fragility, ways of sitting with those things. That is necessary to sustain me, and that is a necessary way of looking after me. And another thing that then sustains me is I think I spent a long time very angry about the world, right, in a self-destructive way. I was always working from a place of unprocessed anger. I was always fighting something hard. I was flinging myself into political struggles in a very unsustainable way, and in a way that did break me in a number of different ways, because I was so angry about the world all the time. And I burned out on that, obviously. And then I went through a period of trying not to be so angry. And that didn't really work either. That I ended up just suppressing a whole bunch of anger and not even being with my anger and pretending that I wasn't angry and covering up my hurt, right? So that didn't work either. Last year, I read a book by Lama Rod Owens that was about political trauma, about anger. I've lost the name now, so I'm going to have to put it in references after the event, but the author is Lama Rod Owens. And one line in that was that anger is trying to tell us something, that you can look after anger and it's trying to tell you something, that when you're angry, you're reacting to something in yourself and something in the world that is actually important. And the one thing that you can do with anger is to pay attention to it and to give it space and to work with it, and to instead of then being burned up by that fire, to let the reality and the truth and the presence of that fire teach you and take that teaching into struggle. So that is a practice that I continue to try and work with, and again often fail to work with, and sometimes I'm too angry and sometimes I suppress my anger. But learning to forgive myself and learning to look after my anger rather than burn it up or deny it, those are practices that have sustained me and make me a little bit better each year, and make the cycles of burnout a little bit less punishing each time.
I can really relate to that. Really relate to that. Sabah or Shon, would you like to kind of share your reflections?
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't mind either way. That, I mean, to be honest, what Josie's answer felt so comprehensive in many ways. I don't know. I mean, lots of it resonated with me, and I agree with her. I think. I suppose I would add what sustains me. suppose one thing I would add that has been useful for me, is to be to think harder and more deeply about what is the and I mean literally pen and paper. What are the priorities of my work? What are the aims of it, and what represents more of a challenge or a destructive force to me than a good one? And to actually become quite ruthless about those. And I don't mean people, I mean positions and context. So like a very classic example would be that I left Twitter like a couple of weeks ago, and I won't be going back. I didn't do like a big flounce off. But the reason being is that as someone that has a media career, what I had understood the whole time was that to have any kind of media career, to be a journalist, to be a writer, you have to have Twitter. It's like this public facing, this is how you brand yourself, this is how you get work. And for a time it was. But it had slipped into something else. It slipped into something that I had to manage, a source of stress, anxiety, pessimism, nihilism at times, not just because of how trans people are treated and talked about on that platform, but also just about how that platform encourages you to be combative, how it encourages you to, the kind of more destructive anger that Josie alluded to, which is it encourages both anger, but a feeling of powerlessness because of the way that it's set up to be overwhelming. And so, yeah, I think I got to a point where I was like, actually, what, I have to, even though, I loved lots about it and it was a way of forming community, especially a few years ago, is to look and be like, well, look, I know enough people now. Maybe this will encourage me to pick up the phone, resistant as a millennial, etc. And so, yeah, something like that is a very classic example. I mean, it won't be for everyone. I'm not saying everyone, because there's lots of people will have a need, for example, for social media. But it might be other things. At other times in my life, it was like, it was thinking about balancing the need for community, but going necessarily, if you're going out to clubs like 3 times a week, maybe that's not like in terms of your sleep levels and energy levels or whatever. Certainly when I was younger, that was something that I realized I was giving myself over to community, the kind of community spaces where there was maybe a kind of physical and mental price to be paid, and so I could cut back on that. And then in terms of what sustains me on a more positive note, rather than cutting things out, because I think that sounds a bit dramatic. Yeah, I mean, I can only speak really of my own experience again, is that I think to maintain sanity when you're often doing stuff in a profession like the media, which is so hostile, is to really have a clear distinction as much as possible between your work and your personal life, to have a distinction between a public self and a private self, to try and not fulfill the private self with the public self. Because that's also what can lead you into trouble too, because if you need that validation, you'll end up saying something silly in public or kind of, overstepping the mark beyond your considered work and what you're actually trying to do. And for me, that obviously revolves around having friends I trust around me in personal life, about having interests, hobbies, discussions, conversations several times a week where you don't discuss stuff that relates to your work. And you have the opportunity to kind of grow and not be talking about the same things all the time, and to consider other people's perspectives and learn from other people. And I think that's really important, particularly with other trans people. I think it's really, really important to not just talk about the material issues of being trans with them all the time. Sometimes it will sink into like discussing sex and surgery, but like try and discuss other things. So I think that kind of having the right relief, spaces for joy, spaces for reflection on culture, books, music, etc., as things that sustain me, particularly in the work that I do at the moment.
Oh, nice. I love that, Shon. And it's so much of what we also have learned from young people as well. Like, of course, we are role models and modeling what self-care and looks like as youth workers, but also like our young people coming to us and just wanting to like play games in our groups instead of talk about, transition or like healthcare or family. It's like, no, let's just play this virtual puzzle game together. or something. It's so important to have that. In terms of what sustains me, I am also going to try and not sound too negative, but I guess I was thinking about what didn't sustain me, and that was treating when I was experiencing physical symptoms of like burnout, it was treating it as like in a physical way. So like, oh, yeah, my head is spinning, I'm going to lie down, or I feel like a migraine kind of coming on, I'm going to drink a glass of water, when actually it's not just that. Like, burnout is not just physical, it's emotional, it's psychological, it's intergenerational, it's global, it's personal, it's everything. So doing everything is what will sustain me. Like, I think that's what they call like a holistic approach. It's like it's taking into account all of those aspects of an experience, and then treating that experience in all of those different aspects as well. And I learned that after losing my dad, that I need all these things as well. Like I need one-to-one therapy, but I also need groups with other people who've lost their parents and other bereaved people. I need information. I need my friends who haven't got the same experiences. I need time to dance. I need to go to the clubs and hit them up, and I need alone time as well. I need all of those things. And grief is loss, and I think people on the margins, we face so much loss in so many different ways, not just through bereavement. So I think we all need everything to sustain. It's not just like picking one item to self-care today or this week, which, I mean, it's a great start, but I think when our lives and experiences are so complex, and how our bodies and minds respond to it, we need to also think about not doing just one thing and making sure it's all of those things. And I need to be honest as well, Shon, I think you talked really beautifully about making sure that your self-indulgent isn't like a self-harm, like it's not going to be something that hurts you. And Josie, I liked what you said about just being honest with yourself about your own fragility and those kind of failures as well. So yeah, just being honest about this is where I'm lacking, this is what I really need, and just doing it. Just doing it. So simple. Oh, I think Ames is frozen. Oh no. We play this game in our youth groups on Zoom as well. Are they frozen or just still?
Yeah. There you go. I'll just do that. Yeah, so thank you. So I could hear you all. It's just thinking my internet's a bit chunky, so I apologise. So I'm still here. I can hear everybody. It's just thinking that the screen keeps cutting out. And but no, I'm glad actually that I think it's something that I think you've all three of you that I could have hit on topics and points that I really resonate with, and particularly Josie, when you were talking about anger, and I think it's an idea about, and actually it's almost like kind of a forgiveness, and also realizing about anger being something that can actually be productive, and that kind of links also into that idea about self-destruction and that and self-indulgence, but also I think that idea about joy as well. I think that's come across really strongly, and I think it's something I think we may have touched upon in last year as well, which is the sense of that actually being able to have conversations that aren't. This is also why I kind of wanted to turn the end of the panel to more towards this, because it's also this awareness that we're not just here to talk about problems and and difficult and painful histories. There's also actually histories of of joy of particular individuals and movements and moments, and culture and text, and what you were saying, Josie, about having that sustaining kind of bookshelves. And I completely I think probably all of us relate to that in whatever ways, and this kind of thing of having having kind of whether it's records or Blu-rays, DVDs, physical media, images, having this around us. And it's not like necessarily a reminder of pain. Often it's about kind of a reminder of joy and a connection to that as well. So I think it's kind of, as a last question, hopefully you can all hear me okay, because I think my internet's a bit dodgy again. But I think there was I think at least two of you kind of mentioned this sort of in passing, but thinking about role models as well. And it doesn't have to be a role model necessarily from our very specific in different communities, but in terms of thinking about kind of care, kind of caregivers or care providers, or just having like someone who sort of shows a model of kind of self-sustaining rather than self-care. I think I quite like self-sustaining. Is there anybody that you like to kind of give a particular kind of shout out to, or kind of think about that their impact on the ways in which you think about caring for yourself and or others in your community?
I'm very grateful for that question, because I was just running through my head, like being a nerd, wanting just to provide a bit of a list of citations for the kind of things that I've been talking about today. I also think it's possible that in response to my words, my camera has adjusted itself and given you one of my bookshelves. Is that also more of my bed, but whatever, that seems very appropriate. So there, spot the book. If you can guess any of the books, I won't give you a prize. So just to provide some citations, and which are again are like, I suppose, sources of inspiration, but for the kind of things that I've been talking about, because like none of these ideas are developed alone, and I don't own any of them. For material on ways that trans people look after each other, and also I suppose the conditions of trans lives and the sort of non-perfectibility of trans lives. I would look at Nat Raha's papers on subjects of trans social reproduction and trans feminine brokenness, both important papers to me. And also Hill Malatino's book, Trans Care, goes into a lot of this stuff in a North American context. And then, like, as I think the material that might be more familiar to this audience, but nonetheless I'll mention, like, I do come to the way I think about trans from a mad pride perspective. And so the book Mad Matters, which came out of Canada as a Mad Studies reader, very important for shaping my own understanding of my complex relationship, my sort of multivalent relationship to psychiatry. And similarly, I subscribe to and read Asylum magazine very loyally and get very sustained by that connection to a broader body of thinking. Yeah.
Is it cheeky to say everyone who's on the panel last year are part of my inspiration for learning and realizing, remembering to care for myself? Soraya and Kay and Meg John Barker as well. Really awesome people who just talk and write about the things our community needs. It's really helped me to remember that. And I think probably just my friends who are youth workers and people I work with as well, just how much we implement care into our conversations and into our practice, and remind each other that we do need to build care into our youth work practice before our work with young people begins. But also young people as well, trans young people, who are building these spaces in alternative ways of doing healthcare and other ways of care and kind of therapeutic practices and joyful spaces. You know, they're really building them for younger people and everyone to survive in. We had a group last night which was around medical and social transition, and we kind of did this is what the options are out there. And then just at the end of the session, I have this massive list of links of queer and trans inclusive healthcare providers and information about GPs and places to get your hormones checked in safe ways. And it was just like, wow, so like our community is doing it. Like this is our ways of caring for ourselves. And it was actually, the framing was really, it's difficult and it's negative, and this, relying on the NHS and healthcare and is sad at the moment. But at the end of it, I was just like feeling really uplifted because we've got this, and it was just really, it left me with a lot of hope. So yeah.
I'm trying to think. So in terms, I actually would want to shout out Rennie Edo-Lodge, who wrote Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, because I kind of reached out to her over the summer before like my own book came out, basically being like, help, because she was someone that has now had several years of working, promoting a book, talking about these ideas, you know, as a Black woman in the British media, with a level of success that I think perhaps she didn't anticipate at the start. So she's obviously had to learn a lot, but I kind of knew from afar that I was quite impressed with how she managed to set boundaries around that work and to think about how, both about the ethics of her work, but also clearly it seemed like she was someone that had strong ideas about how to sustain a career in that way without leading into burnout. And so she is someone that I've been in contact with regularly since then. And she's been a huge, source of guidance and inspiration to me in really practical ways as well, for quite a unique situation when you're essentially a writer, not like someone that necessarily, you know, the fact that writers now are expected to be lots of different things, particularly if you're a writer from a minority, particularly if you write about your minority status and you're educating people, which everyone seems to want now, being told what to think. And so resisting some of the roles that are being carved out for you and thinking about how you can, and she also maintains links with activist communities even now. And it's about that once you start to enter a space where perhaps you're not, you know, not as connected on a daily level as you were to perhaps some of the grassroots work that you were doing when you first had these ideas to write about. It's about how you maintain that link, again, in an ethical way. So I would mention her just on a personal note. And then, yeah, I think otherwise it's a lot of trans people in my life. In the acknowledgements of my book, I kind of mentioned a few. So like my friend Cara, who works at Gendered Intelligence also, and Robin Craig, who's a writer. Those two in particular, I think during the pandemic and when I was sort of like working on the stuff that's now public facing and private, I just really like as well, like, trans people that like allow me to access the humorous, light-hearted side of myself when I'm often forced into situations where I have to be very serious. Because there are ways that we might talk amongst ourselves that wouldn't necessarily be appropriate or useful to talk in front of people that don't share our experience. And I think it's really important to sustain yourself in those ways too. And obviously I couldn't do that alone. And so, I'm grateful to trans people generally and those people I mentioned.
Oh, thank you. Oh, so heartwarming. So after there's so many, structural, institutional, kind of often sometimes interpersonal, problems and difficulties, but there is kind of, I really like what you were saying, Sabah, about we're out there doing it, and I think there is, that's it, isn't it? It's like, it doesn't necessarily have to be in those positions, but at least there's still, hopefully there's enough of us to keep on going as well. And I just on a personal note as well, just to kind of like shout out in a similar way to like with Shon, like my friends Izzy and Karen, who kind of through lockdown were just like a massive kind of lifeline, and been able to just have those kind of just random chats about pets and just and drag race, and to be able to kind of have that shorthand is just so just so important. And also I want to kind of say that I now realise how unusual it is, but on my local GP surgery, I've gone back to the same GP surgery that traumatized me when I was 3 years old with kind of military style kind of injections. But actually, they don't have to be, but they're incredibly LGBTQ inclusive, which for sort of a small local practices, it might be quite surprising, but they've been very it's as best as they can, but I think which is actually better than a lot of what I've found from other people's experiences in terms of healthcare and asking the right kinds of questions and not questions that just kind of re-traumatize as well. So just to kind of give them a bit of a shout out and maybe a good model of practice. I'm aware of the time, and I know that all three of you are so super busy, and I can't tell you how much like we on behalf of like NSUN and the team are just so kind of grateful for your time and for sharing insights, and just really hope that it feels kind of sustaining in its own way as well, that kind of hopefully going on into your day and feeling okay. And just also to say a big thank you to Kaisha for kind of providing support today as well, and also Amy, because Amy just basically did all the organising as well. So yeah, thank you so much, both of you, and yeah, just thank you, and thanks to the three of you, and thank you for being so open and sharing your experiences and thoughts as well.
Oh, thank you, Ames, and Josie and Shon. It was awesome to do this with both of you. Yeah, I have kept up with some of your writings as well, so it's been really cool to share space. And thank you, Kaisha, for doing all the tech stuff that I don't understand.
Yeah, thank you. I just reiterate that as well.
Yeah, thank you all for
Thank
this
you so much,
conversation.
everyone.